The costs of war and militarism are multiple and accumulative. While my main focus in this brief summary will be on the human cost of war, with the emphasis on children, there are huge financial costs, costs due to environmental damage, damage to infrastructure, destruction of medical and educational facilities, and huge damage to all other living creatures on this planet. One of the most serious costs of wars in recent decades has been the damage done to genuine rule of international and humanitarian laws. These are the real and actual costs of wars. But there are also other potential costs which must be factored in, especially the risk of a catastrophic nuclear war. This Lex Innocentium 21st Century project is a very creative initiative seeking to address some of these critically important issues. All of these interlinked costs combine to create existential threats to all of humanity and impact especially on children and on all other living creatures, including the environment. The trauma that wars cause are not just temporary trauma that occur when people are directly impacted by bombs and bullets. Such individual trauma can last for a lifetime and can be multi-generational at community and national levels. Moral injury or psychological damage to soldiers, especially those who participate in the killing of innocent civilians, results in a suicide epidemic among soldiers and military veterans. Since 1973, well over 1,000 Israeli soldiers have committed suicide, according to the official statistics, but the actual number is believed to be many multiples of that. In the US, an average of 16 veterans commit suicide every single day. Why is the killing of children in wars so important? Children are the most innocent of the innocent. They are, if you like, the Innocentium. I will be 80 years of age next year, so if you kill me, you're only destroying a little portion of my life. If you kill a young child, you are destroying almost all that child's lives, and all that child's human rights are also destroyed. Children do not cause wars, they are the innocent victims, so-called collateral damage, allegedly getting in the way of necessary military actions. The rules of war, including the Geneva Conventions on War, actually allow for the killing of children in wars, provided that some steps are taken to theoretically minimise the deaths of civilians, including children. There should be no rules for wars, because in this age of weapons of mass destruction, there should be no wars. We do not have a set of rules or legal rules for how one should carry out a bank robbery or commit a murder. Of course, the criminal gangs who commit these crimes have their own set of rules. The rules for wars are made mainly by the most powerful states who want to use wars as politics by other means. While our Western media is giving us daily reports on Russian aggressions in Ukraine, we are hearing very little about the illegality of wars of aggression waged since the end of the Cold War by the US and NATO and other allies, in breach of the UN Charter, costing millions of lives of people. Wars in Africa, especially in Sudan and the Congo, that are costing the lives of far more people than the wars in Ukraine or the Middle East. UN sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s, imposed by the US and others, caused the deaths of over 500,000 children under 5 years of age, and of course also even more of children over 5 years of age. When questioned by a reporter on this carnage, US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright responded that the deaths of so many young children were justified. During the Afghan war, both Donald Rumsfeld and General Tommy Franks used the phrase, "We don't do body counts." We are told, even by our Irish government, that these wars, especially the war in Ukraine, are justified under rules-based international order. NATO is arguably being used by the US as its criminal enforcer in what amounts, in my view, to a protection racket to maintain its grip of an undue share of the world's increasingly scarce resources. Because such deliberate efforts to minimise or hide the death toll of children killed in wars it is necessary to commemorate the all too short lives of as many as possible of these children, to highlight and expose the killing of children. A project called Naming the Children has been initiated to try and record and find creative ways of doing this. It will only be possible to find the names of a small fraction of those children killed in wars, so our hope is that those we do name can be representative of the many millions of children who have died so cruelly and needlessly killed. Our human minds have difficulty coping with the reality of large statistics of human suffering. It's important, therefore, to focus on individual cases of suffering and trauma to better understand the level of trauma being suffered by the peoples of Palestine, Ukraine, Sudan, Congo, Yemen, and elsewhere. The following are just some examples. On the 18th of August last, an Israeli bomb struck the home of teacher Hala Katab in Gaza, killing Hala and her 6 children. They include her elder son Hussein, aged 15, her 9-year-old quadruplets. Their names were Kenan, Haman, Lujain, Sibal, and her baby girl Joaquin, aged just 18 months old. 115 newborn babies have been reported killed in Gaza since October 2023. That statistic includes twins Asael Arafa and Asser Arafa, who were both 3 days old when they and their mother, Jumana, a medical doctor, were killed in an Israeli airstrike in central Gaza on the 13th of August last. Doctors, teachers, hospitals, mosques and schools have all been targeted by the Israeli military. The killing of children and adults in Gaza by bombing, snipers' bullets, disease and starvation is neither accidental nor due to military necessity. It is deliberate, and the International Court of Justice has ruled that Palestinians in Gaza have plausible rights under the Genocide Convention. Over 2,219 Palestinians, including 556 children, were killed in Gaza in the Israeli attack in 2014. That list of children includes, in my view, 4 sets of twins. Their names and ages were as follows: Otman Brahim, age 17, Fadi Brahim, age 17, Ahed Bakr, age 10, Zachariah Bakr, age 10, Rami Ayad, age 3, Ashraf Ayad, age 3, Maria Abu Jaber, age 2, Fikris Abu Jaber, age 2. May they rest in peace. Over the last few months, the administration in Gaza has been so overwhelmed, and so many medical and aid agency workers have themselves been killed. The death statistics and names are no longer accurately recorded. For several weeks now, the numbers of people reported in the media killed has stalled around 40,000. The reality is that the number of killed had been increasing, and the total number killed is likely to be many multiples of 40,000. And this killing amounts to genocide. 8 children were killed in 9/11 attacks on the USA. They include one Irish-American child, Juliana Clifford McCourt, age 4, who happened to be on one of the planes that was crashed into the Twin Towers. That terrorist attack and the deaths of almost 3,000 people do not in any way justify the killing of innocent children worldwide in the meantime, in US wars of revenge and resource wars. Since the first Gulf War in 1991, our initial estimates were that at least 1 million children had died due to war-related reasons in a series of conflicts from the wider Middle East, from Libya to Afghanistan. When we include other wars, especially in Africa, the deaths of all children who have died due to war-related reasons since the end of the so-called Cold War, then the number of children who have died may exceed 5 million. All lives matter, including the lives of soldiers killed in wars, and especially the lives of civilians and other non-combatants. However, those of us who have contributed to the Naming the Children project firmly believe that the lives of children and the protection of children in all circumstances, including in wars, must be prioritised. All societies, including governments and the so-called international community, have a solemn duty to protect children who are not in a position to protect themselves. The grim statistics from the ongoing genocide in Gaza include over 40,000 killed, including over 16,000 children, more than 100,000 injured, more than 10,000 still missing. At least 289 UN UNRWA staff and aid workers have been killed. As a former UN peacekeeper, I take that almost personal. 885 health workers have been killed. At least 116 journalists and media workers were killed. More than half of Gaza's homes, 80% of commercial facilities, 85% of school buildings have been destroyed or damaged. Only 16 of the 36 hospitals are partially functioning, and that has probably become much less in the meantime. 65% of road networks destroyed, 65% of crops land damaged. The slaughter of so many innocent children especially must not be allowed to continue. The war crimes and genocide that are occurring in Gaza have catastrophic implications for the Palestinian people. These crimes have also damaging implications for the people of Israel and Jewish people globally, and critical implications for the rule of international law and global justice. These crimes are being perpetrated by an apartheid and colonizing state that claims to be democratic, with the active support of the US and supported by several NATO and EU member states. The Holocaust perpetrated against the Jewish people by the German Nazi regime was the worst genocide in the history of humanity so far. Palestinian people are being killed at an alarming rate, and international peace is increasingly endangered. The United Nations was founded so that such atrocities could never happen again. The rule of international law was reinforced by several important conventions and international humanitarian laws. All these vital laws and conventions are being broken or set aside, not just by Israel, but by the US and its allies, and more recently by Russia. The governments of many other countries, including Ireland, are also partly or directly complicit by their actions, inactions, and silence. Such crimes provide dreadful examples for dictators and human rights abusers worldwide, and are likely to result in increases in such crimes, including genocide. From my research into the multiple acts of genocide, I have concluded that genocide continues to occur because it is perceived to be a successful way of achieving the dreadful objectives of those states who commit genocide. While the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have made important rulings and opinions against Israel, they have little power to stop these crimes or to impose sanctions on Israel, because the US, the UK and others are misusing their UN Security Council veto to prevent accountability. This causes further damage to the proper rule of international and humanitarian laws. We must also consider the costs associated with the failure to make peace. It is too easy for national leaders to make war. Countries and arms industries have stockpiled huge quantities of weapons and armaments, including weapons of mass destruction. To justify such dangerous and unjustified expenditure, they need to initiate and provoke wars. Making peace is always more difficult and more complicated, but the resources applied towards making peace are tiny compared with the resources applied to making war. The annual total budget for the United Nations is about $10 billion per annum. SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Institute, estimates, as was mentioned by Eamon early on, for the total expenditure by all members of the UN for 2023 as $2.43 trillion. And in case you want that in billions, it amounts to $2,444 billion for military expenditure versus just $10 billion for the United Nations. This does not take into account all the other costs of wars and warfare destruction, including the destructions of lives that I have already mentioned. I have said very little really about the cost of wars to Ireland, because in some respects Ireland is profiting from wars, at least in the short term at Shannon Airport and elsewhere, like many other Western countries. However, the long-term costs of wars to all of humanity pose existential threats to all life on planet Earth. I will finish with one example of children killed in the Syrian conflict, which is still happening, even though it's getting very little publicity. I visited Syria in 2017 with a group of Irish peace activists to get the names of children killed in the war in Syria. The Syrian conflict was very active at the time in Damascus and Aleppo and elsewhere, with anti-government forces supported by the US, UK, Turkey and others. On the 15th of April 2017, just 6 months before our visits to Syria, a bus convoy evacuating mainly women and children from the towns of Al-Fua and Al-Kafria, which had been under siege by Western-supported anti-government forces. These were affiliated to both ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They had to be evacuated because they were starving. The convoy was stopped and delayed before it entered government-controlled Aleppo province. The driver of a car began handing out sweets, biscuits and drinks, soft drinks to the starving children. When a crowd of children surrounded the car, a massive explosion and fireball was set off, killing over 80 children. On our visit to Aleppo and Damascus, we met survivors of the bombing of the bus convoy. Several, including 2 children, told their story of losing family members and witnessing the aftermath of the bombing. 10 of the dead children could not be identified because their bodies were so badly burned. Up to 20 of the children were still missing 6 months later. I will never forget the story of one old woman who was in tears as she told us that the bombing killed 7 of her immediate family, including her daughter and 4 grandchildren. Despite her grief and trauma, she said, "I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming all this way from Ireland to hear your story." It was the first time many of these survivors have been able to tell their story. She was in tears as she was telling us this, and so were some of us who were listening to her. That is the reality of war, and that is what we must stop, particularly the killing of children. Let's hope this Lex Innocentium initiative to revive this ancient legal status will help with the protection of innocent civilians in wars. Thank you for listening, and thank you for all involved in this project.